citizen.
Out of many
we are world citizens. Same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voice.
Welcome to another episode of the People-Powered Planet podcast, where each week we bring you amazing solutionaries who are looking at not just what are the problems of the world, but how do we actually solve those problems? How do we actually create new tools and evolve new systems and create a vision of how we move toward the kind of world we want? And today we have a very special guest. We have Andreas Bummel, who is the founder and executive director of Democracy Without Borders. Imagine that, democracy without borders. Now, he's one of the leading experts and advocates for a world parliament. He's been leading an effort for a Parliamentary Assembly at the UN that's supported by more than 1,500 parliamentarians in over 100 countries. So that's quite a network he's been building. And he co-convenes the We the People's campaign. And that we're going to want to hear more about, because that's over 200 groups, including environmental groups and civil rights groups and NGOs, all moving toward what essentially is what our project is all about. How do we, the peoples, find a way that we can govern our planet and build a better world? And we'll also, toward the end, let him tell you about his book. So you can order that and catch up more about him. So welcome, Andreas. We're very pleased to have you here on the People-Powered Planet podcast.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for the invitation. It's my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So just to establish the framework for what we're going to talk about today, can we just take 1 minute? Could you summarize in 1 minute what is the peril that the world is facing now that gives rise to the need for democracy without borders? What do you see as the current state of the world, and why is it so important that we evolve some alternate visions of how we run this planet?
Yes, well, this is first of all true that there is a global poly crisis emerging and going on for quite some time already. Poly crisis means that there are difficult situations going on in different fields at the same time that are interrelated, and one of which obviously is the climate crisis. But we can also see right now that issues of security and peace are still high on the agenda, with the Russian attack on Ukraine, the current terrorism in Israel and Palestine. So the poly crisis is really an excavating global phenomenon that is actually in itself maybe threatening even the survival of highly developed world civilization. If you look at the nuclear threat that is heightened again, but also emerging technologies are posing many questions, such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology. We have just witnessed a global pandemic. We don't know where the COVID virus really came from. The origins are still not established. So all of this is really, calling for new forms of global governance. But I want to say this is all true. But even if all of this, even if we were living in a more stable situation, the need for global governance is also one in principle, because it would have to recognize the equal value of every human being on the planet as such, so there is a matter of principle at play as well.
Yes, and of course, a lot of those principles were established in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which the nations of the world unanimously established that we do have those rights and freedoms, and we have a right to a political system at the global level that does further and represent our interests. And yet, somehow, we failed to keep that promise of the Universal Declaration that the nations unanimously passed. back in 1948. How does your project, Democracy Without Borders, seek to shift that? Tell us more about Democracy Without Borders and what its objectives are, and how it might begin to further the objective you mentioned, and help provide some solution to these polycrises you mentioned that convergently are coming together to threaten the very existence of all of us here on planet Earth.
Well, in fact, it is very on point that you are mentioning the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, not only because it's now the 75th anniversary that we will celebrate next month, but also because Democracy Without Borders as an organization also refers to it. Insofar as that we say that Article 21, for instance, actually says quite in a clear way that the authority of government and public, the exercise of public authority needs to be based on the will of the people. And we argue that this is a human right, actually, that expands from the local to the global scale. And this is perhaps novel, that we really argue that there is a right to global democracy that also stems from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So Democracy Without Borders is looking at how this right can be implemented globally. And I can elaborate more on that if you wish.
Yes, I would like to hear about Democracy Without Borders. What a great name, Democracy Without Borders. Just the very name connotates a vision of a world that lifts our spirits. Tell us more about Democracy Without Borders.
Yeah, I mean, the name actually alludes to two dimensions, I would say. First of all, without borders, obviously taking literally, it means that democratic collaboration, decision-making, deliberation, representation, and participation actually needs to transcend national boundaries, right? So at this stage of development in the world, in the most regions and countries, democracy, if it exists at all, it stops at national borders. But issues don't stop at national borders. It is humanity has become a community of faith in many ways. So decision-making and all this would have to go beyond national borders. And in Europe, we have European Parliament, and there is a development towards European democracy as well, but really we need this at the global scale. This is the one dimension, but the other dimension is really that democracy as a concept, as a living concept, has to be rethought and really, has to be innovated continuously. I think that is a characteristic of democracy, that it is never finished and that it is ongoing. And this is the other thing. Without borders means we need to think about innovating democracy without, limiting ourselves, and innovate it, renew it, including at the global scale. That are the two meanings. And one more thing, perhaps, all of this obviously implies the idea and reality of global citizenship, because who exercises the right to democracy? That is the citizens. And global citizenship in this way, it's not an ideal. It's not a thought or some identity, an inclination. It is supposed to be. Citizenship is supposed to be a legal manifestation of a global demos and a global polity that goes along with rights and responsibilities. And this is also almost non-existent at this stage of global development, and that needs to be changed.
Wow, well, you've mentioned two crucial points that we want to follow up on. World citizenship is what Gary Davis and our whole podcast and program is all, and a movie and so on, are all about. But before I get to that, I want to touch on the first issue you mentioned, and that is, since you're calling in now from Germany, which is where your home is, correct?
That is correct, yes, Wiesbaden, to be specific.
And so you remember when Germany was bitterly at war with France, so when the continent was torn apart with wars, and yet in the last 70 years, no member of the European Parliament has fought a war with another one. There may have been internal civil wars or other challenges, but somehow this continent that was torn apart by two world wars and war after war after war found some kind of a solution that seemed to prevent war within it. What was that solution, and what does that solution perhaps offer the world as a model?
Well, the solution that has been found in the process of European integration early on was the concept and idea that's been implemented over time of shared sovereignty, which means that countries would recognize crucial areas of collaboration, and they would actually transfer power in these areas of collaboration to a higher entity, which is now the European Union. So this began by recognizing that there are crucial resources in war making, minerals, oil, coal, and steel, also control of nuclear energy, and over time, the management and control of such resources in Europe were transferred to a so-called higher authority, which is now the European Union. So that is something I believe that can be taken from the process of European integration, which is still ongoing, that individual countries need to give away part of their power of sovereignty. And I think the important twist in this is that there needs to be a recognition that this is not a loss. A country does not lose anything if it shares sovereignty with others and puts it together in a higher entity. Actually, it gains sovereignty. I would like to, point out, for instance, the field of taxation. So the global situation in the field of taxation is that there are tax havens and loopholes all around, and countries coming closer together in this field allows them to close these loopholes, to harmonize taxation rules, and actually to re-establish, that is at least the idea, their tax base, right? So they don't lose anything. They literally, in this case, they actually gain something if it is done right.
And that leads to, of course, another sort of side issue, which is that a lot of the challenges we face in the world is that the corporations have risen above nations by operating globally, while we, the people, are locked in these boxes called nation states. And so they're kind of able to wield all the power and buy the best politicians money can buy. And only by, do you see evolving global democracy as a way that the power of these corporations can be harnessed to serve the people, rather than creating destructive things which threaten our very well-being, health, well-being, and safety, and the existence of our planet?
I mean, the short answer to this is really absolutely. Of course, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't say that corporations per se are bad, right? But the system that we have actually forces for-profit organizations to play it as best as they can, right, in order to remain competitive. So the point is that I believe the current world order of 193 nation states that all have their own rules and governments, etc., is the best status quo they can have, because they can play them all against each other. Not there's this term race to the bottom, and that's exactly what's been happening in the tax field, for instance. So I would say that the large corporations, this is true, and also high net worth individuals, the super rich, in other words, they do have an interest that the current situation just remains as it is. Because if there was a higher global authority that was able to make uniform regulations, no loopholes would exist. They couldn't, play these governments against each other anymore. So this is part of the struggle. But here again, I would eventually argue that it is in the best interest of well-intentioned corporations that there can be universal law, because this would mean law applies to all, the same. And that makes, the rules to all, which is a very, a level playing field for all in terms of competition. And now it's not like that.
Well, that's a very good point. I think if I were a corporate executive and I was thinking, well, I really want to leave a better world for my children. I really don't want to be, running these polluting industries and so on. But yet, if I don't do that, my competitor will do it, and I'll be out of business, and I won't be able to do anything worthwhile. So, I'm kind of forced into doing it. But if I'm a forward-thinking corporate executive, I'd say, well, look, let's find a way to make everybody in the same playing field so that we can thrive doing what serves the planet. In other words, very often it's not that they're, as you pointed out, not that they're bad people. They're perfectly good people, but they're in a system that's a race to the bottom. They're very well put. So how do we begin to evolve a race to the top, a race to where we, the people, are on top of our world and can govern it in a sane way?
Well, there are many different possible paths, I would say, that could lead to this goal of a global democracy. Democracy Without Borders has been working specifically on one path that takes the UN, the existing United Nations organization, as a starting point, as that is at this time one of the centers of international deliberation and collaboration, which is, if we like it or not, intergovernmental. That's just how it is. So the idea is that we would turn this exclusive club of government executives into a organization that is people-centered, that allows for different viewpoints to be voiced, even from single countries, which is not the case now. And one tool, it's not the only one, but one tool to do that is the creation of a parliamentary body. Parliaments over the course of human history and socio-political evolution, if you like, they have developed in different places and in different ways as key components, not the only ones, of course, but key components to allow for democratic deliberation and decision-making. So the question is, well, in a democracy, we elect our local councillors, we elect people at the regional level, our representatives, and at the state level, we elect them at the federal level. In the European Union, we even elect them supranationally, for the continent. And then what? And then nothing. So that is a problem. So we actually, that is the vision. We, the people on the planet, need to be able to elect our global representatives as well. But that has many ramifications, obviously. So after all, it is a top-down, but also a bottom-up process, because if you imagine global elections, so how could people in undemocratic countries actually participate in free and fair competitive global elections? They can't. And that's why the idea of global democracy per se is connected to ongoing democratization, a successful struggle for democracy at all levels, particularly at the national level in dictatorships and autocracies. So this is really what we are up against.
Well, I think you raise a very key point when you say we have this power, locally, regionally, and so on, but at the global level, nothing. And so there's a huge vacuum, and into that vacuum, the corporations sweep, the criminal syndicates sweep, and so on. It seems to me that this goes back to filling that vacuum has to go back to the fundamental thing you talked about, which is world citizens, that we, the people, need to step up to the plate and begin to take our responsibility to actually look for ways that we can begin to govern our world in a sane way. Tell us a little more about how world citizenship can be the foundation and pillar which can begin to evolve the kind of parliamentary system you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it is correct that each individual can and should recognize their global responsibility and their identity as a planetary citizen, especially in this time of a global civilization, right? Where each of us is essentially interconnected, you know, with COVID, with the pandemic. I think that was quite obvious. You know, one virus transferring to a human in some place can actually cause a global catastrophe. So, and that's exactly what happened. Of course, that was an exceptional case, but to illustrate the point, how interdependent the world is, but each individual actually is. So this is the starting point for sure, to recognize this interdependence and our global existence, that planet Earth is our only home that we will have, in my mind, for a long time to come. And we shouldn't risk it, and that is what's happening. So this is the starting point. I think that global citizens as a potential mass movement have potential strong political power, and that is necessary to mobilize that power, to harness it. However, I think also that the governments are not necessarily all illegitimate, right? So in a way, the structures and the power structures and the political structures that we have, they do, I think, need to face that. They do reflect human nature, and global citizens, they are not separate from that, you see? So in a way, we live in the world that we have made. And the question is, how do we transcend that? How do we get beyond that? I wouldn't argue that politicians or corporate managers, they are not different from people, right? Per se, they are not different human beings. So I think in the end, it is really about building structures, political and institutional structures based on constitutional rights, that keep the worst in human beings at check, right? So that, and also that there are institutional checks and balances. So going back to this mass movement, potential mass movement of global citizens, in the end, at the end of the day, I think this would have to serve the purpose of changing the institutional structures. And one of the big challenges really that globally, as you have pointed out, there is this vacuum. So apart from, you know, in the past, many democratic revolutions were a revolt against autocratic government that was established by elites top down. So the question is, how can we achieve a democratic revolution that is required globally, that is actually establishing government structures? You see, it is really a very tricky situation because we need to mobilize against a vacuum. There is not one autocratic enemy we can see, you know, that we are struggling against. We need to find a way to understand that we need to fill a vacuum. And one more thought perhaps on this. The governments, they are there. They do have military power. They have the police power. They have the power to tax. They have the power of economic redistribution. So in the end, that is part of it. A global citizens movement will also have to change the course of existing governments. So I know, you know, that there are parallel efforts. Let's just build our structures. But as long as that does not impact how the existing governments act and are structured, I think that will be very difficult.
Well, you know, we live in an ironic situation where in virtually every field, the world has turned global. I mean, you know, kids are on their on their devices, chatting with people all over the world. The borders become less and less meaningful. International commerce takes place around the world. We order things from China and get them one day later, with with Amazon and so on. We get, the world has become one in so many ways, and yet we have this anachronistic situation where the nation state system seems like leftover from the horse and buggy days, where we where the best we could do was to have these divisions, and it seems to me that part of what we need is that click in our thinking, that little change from thinking of ourselves as citizens of this nation state we're locked into to being world citizens. And once we're world citizens, what do citizens do? Citizens create governance. Almost everywhere where there have been citizens taking responsibility, they've created, whether it's a tribe, whether it's anything else, they create some system for how do we get along. Otherwise, it's just all, killing each other. So it's either the mother's running a council, it's something, but somehow or another, citizens seem to create governance. And of course, that was the key point that Gary Davis made, who's the inspiration for our program here. How do you see evolving how do you see citizen-based government? First of all, helping people. How do you see getting people aware that we are world citizens, and how do you see that becoming the foundation for beginning to build such a parliamentary system that could either be outside or inside the UN?
Well, I believe that many people, at least surveys, point in this direction, are quite aware of their planetary identity, and they actually, they would say in surveys that they feel like global citizens, in fact. And I believe, for what I have seen in recent polls, that's a majority in most countries, especially if you ask them, do you feel global citizen in addition to your national citizenship? The responses are overwhelmingly in favor of that. So I think that is a process that has already reached quite some maturity already. And I think education is a key to make that even stronger, which means specifically global citizenship education, which is also part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. So I think students everywhere across the world should learn about the global interdependence that exists, and about global challenges like climate change and the climate crisis and other things. So they have more solid substance in terms of what global identity means. But it's true, it's absolutely astonishing that everything has become global except politics lags behind for, yes, centuries perhaps. This is particularly astonishing because of weapons of mass destruction. I find it quite shocking every day that, there are single people on the planet who potentially could launch the nuclear holocaust. And what's been done about it? Not much in 70 years. So this is quite astonishing. Well, and I mean, yes, say again. I mean, the question then was how can we change that as global citizens, right? Can we build something in parallel or not? I believe that this is a good and important tool of mobilization, right? But in the end, the struggle will have to be to change the government that we have. I mean, in some cases, I would even say to topple them in so far as that they are autocratic. But then again, we also need to realize this is not happening in a void, right? So most democracies, or all democracies, I mean, from a certain point on, it is no longer valid to call a country a democracy, but let's say those we can identify as democracies, they are more or less legitimate in my point of view, so citizens have already come together to establish these governments. They have just not gone far enough to the global scale. So I would say that citizens would have to take their responsibility in the community they live in, also at the nation state level, take their responsibility there and push their legitimate government, if such exists, to actually move forward a program of global integration and global shared sovereignty. This is not impossible. I mean, it has happened in the European Union, right? It has happened there. It can happen globally too, I think.
Right, right. Well, so many people, when I think you're right that people actually do think globally. I mean, my T-shirt says "The world is my country."
Well, for you, that is for sure.
When I wear that, I find so many people come up to me and they say, "Oh yeah,
Oh,
I feel the same way. The world's my country." And young people think, well, naturally, the world's our country. I mean, they kind of don't quite understand. Oh yeah, there you've got your world passport. Exactly. I think people are evolving in that kind of thinking, and yet, as you said, the nation states have us stuck in that old thing. It seems to me that one of the things that that Gary Davis would say was that once we realize we're world citizens, that it evolves from the people to the global level, and that these problems that you would say, well, I mean, well, if citizens govern the world, look at the mess there is, all the different sides fighting each other and so on. What he was proposing is that he was a great fan of Buckminster Fuller, and Buckminster Fuller said, that you never change things by fighting the existing reality. And Einstein said something similar: you can't change things at the problems at the level at which they were created. You've got to rise above that and create something new and draw people to it. And what Gary said is, instead of knocking our heads against the wall trying to convince these politicians to give up their power and change to something else, why don't we do that? The way we see innovation happening in the world is like, to create Facebook. They didn't have to get permission to do that. Some college students got together, they created this new tool, and that new tool began to take off. Well, Gary talked a lot about it, and Bucky talked about being tool makers. And he said, why don't we create an interactive tool, a synergistic one, not one where we're, fighting against each other and 51% win and the other 49 lose, and then we're angry and we go back and forth. But he said that if you take the model of Bucky Fuller's geodesic sphere, and you imagine, like these Zoom conferences we have, you imagine people from around the world coming together in small groups, synergistic groups, where instead of saying who's right and who's wrong, you have certain topics that help you come together. For example, if you took any conflict, Arabs and Jews, for example, or Palestinians and Israelis, and you had them in a room saying, well, what is it you really want in life? What do you want for your children? What's your vision? What's your story? You find a synergistic thing comes together. If you say who's right and who's wrong, you're going to just battle each other out. But if you develop this more synergistic model, you can begin to evolve a way that you come to common ground. And if you had all these different synergistic groups interacting with others, you could create a global deliberative process that would be a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom, as the current political system seem to be. What do you think about the possibility of, rather than simply trying to lobby and plead and beg the existing system to reform itself, of somehow following that disruptive model of creating new tools that could evolve and bring us into the global citizenship and a new kind of global deliberative process where we the people are involved, and where even people on opposite sides of the issues can come together?
Yes, I mean, like I implied at the beginning, I believe there are many possible ways to tackle the issue that can run in parallel, and that are not mutually exclusive, right?
Right.
So I think having such a process in place, or building it like the one you described, certainly is a good thing, and that is useful. And nonetheless, I would say, I mean, I I happen to work on a different path, right? But that path does not exclude other paths, right? That is important. And even, the Parliamentary Assembly, for instance, which has been for a long time my preoccupation, the primary, I mean, that is also only a piece of the puzzle of a larger picture, right? So I recognize that. It's just that for efficiency and for impact, it has proven to be useful to focus on one thing. I mean, it's difficult enough already and very complex. So if you tackle many things at the same time, you water down your impact. So that is what I think. But maybe I can add one more thought. I do think that still we have to take into account the reality that there are in the world different diverging interests. And I don't think that there are deliberative models in principle that can just, by talking and thinking, make them vanish. They are there. So I think there need to be solid political institutions that can deal with these different political and economic interests that exist. They don't go away. So finding good solutions and proposals in a deliberate manner you describe, that is a good way, I think, a good contribution. But in the end, there need to be decision-making systems. And it's not, I don't think it's like black and white. I mean, that is the one of the basic agreements in a democracy, that at some point you are part of the majority, right? But at some other point you are the minority, and you accept that these the balances can shift in decision making. So I think both can go hand in hand to make it short.
Great. Well, I thank you. I noticed that we have David Gallup with us, and I would like shortly to move it to a question period. But I see David has put some things in the chat here. Maybe I should at this point let Melanie introduce the question period, and maybe we could start off with David Gallup giving us some comments and input. But let me turn this to Melanie for starters.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you so much. And Andreas, wow, well, we're just so connected. I mean, and I love the fact that, yes, all ideas, we need everybody on board, thinking of this essential question of what's going to keep this wonderful, beautiful place going. We, working together, different ideas, so important. You mentioned the nuclear issue hasn't been solved, but there's some great movement towards that with the treaty, the ban on nuclear weapons. And Arthur and I are going to go to the meeting of the second meeting of the states parties, all these countries that have gotten together and said, that's it, we're finished, done. 69 of them, 93 have said we're going to go back to our country and get this ratified. So 93 total. And then pretty soon, I think it's going to be the way. We just won't have these, and then hopefully no war, et cetera, et cetera. So the main thing is, I wanted to say is it's so wonderful to hear other people working on these issues, other people collaborating with other people. And it's really nice to have you here. So we do want to go to David Gallup for his comments and question. David, go right ahead.
Thanks, Melanie. Well, Andreas, so delightful to see you here. We have never met in person, but I've met you, of course, at many either CGS Citizens for Global Solutions meetings where you've spoken about the UN Parliamentary Assembly, and I know you're deeply involved in the World Federalist Movement, so I'll see you at the annual convention, World Federalist Movement in November, so I'm glad to see you there. And I'm just always so amazed and impressed with your work to build this coalition for the UN Parliamentary Assembly, and of course the long-term goal to have a full-fledged world parliament of the people, because I know that's in your theory of change, that's really a big part of it, right? So I've got I guess a comment and then a question, which I'll end with the question so that it stays fresh in your mind, but I'll start with the comment. And that is, like you said, that there are multiple paths toward this world that we want, a world of peace, justice, sustainability, et cetera. And I've been working on building a coalition for a statute for a World Court of Human Rights. Well, maybe you can't see that, but anyway, so we actually have a couple different draft statutes for that World Court of Human Rights. And what I would love to see, and I just put it in the chat, is if the Democracy Without Borders, maybe as an organization or even individuals within the organization, might want to pledge their support for the creation of a World Court of Human Rights, which would also include environmental rights. And that comment leads me really to my question is, we have a lot of students who are starting World Citizen Clubs on university and high school campuses. And I would love to see, just as I'm asking in a sense, sort of for Democracy Without Borders support for the World Court of Human Rights, how could we get students who are involved in these clubs to, and maybe you could put this in the chat, support, or maybe you just did, but where students could go, even as an online activity, to say, I, as an individual, support the creation of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. What could they do? Could they maybe have you or somebody else in DWB come and speak to an event for students, by students? And how do we engage youth, I guess, is really the ultimate question. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, the question of how to engage youth, I believe, at the largest scale possible, is really that we would influence the official curriculums in schools, actually, through introducing solid programs of global citizenship education. So this is something Democracy Without Borders has on our minds. I mean, we cannot do everything at the same time, but that, that would be a large scale influence. So it's not us actually talking about this. I mean, we do, but at that scale we can't, but it's actually in the schools automatically. So I would say that would be the largest scale possible achievement that we could have, introducing it in official curriculum. So you could do lobbying at the state level, I guess, in the US, for instance. So that happens. Well, and a part of that, how can individual young people and others be involved? I guess in the end, it has to be a bottom-up process. It's great that you are establishing these clubs, because that is how it works with local groups eventually. So I guess Democracy Without Borders might be doing this as well. So we are, for instance, looking at creating a US chapter at first, and then it would think about, okay, how can we localize these efforts? I have to make one more remark. I mean, we are really at the moment pursuing this path of influencing political decision-making. So anything that catches public attention is something that they might be innovative that students could do, in terms of protest, demonstration, public appearance, I don't know, flash mob, etc. And in these days of social media, that's also, a possibility to look at. But I think they are creative and innovative, and it's, I think, not necessarily so that we have to tell them, go to TikTok and take a video. If they are there, they would do it, I guess. Mm-hmm. So it's probably more about building that enthusiasm, right? That they would proactively look at ways how they can support this.
Yes, and oh, David, anything else? Yeah, enthusiasm, that is key. That energizes people to take action. And hope is so important. How come you're hopeful? Why are you doing, what energizes you to do this? What is that spark? What is that joy? What is that for you? What's your motivation? So maybe David could take that to the students, get them motivated. What's yours?
Well, I mean, personally, I have probably, for reasons in my upbringing and all, I have always felt like an identity with the planet, and that's because I'm born in South Africa. I grew up in Eastern Germany, in Western Germany, with Eastern Germany being a hostile state and in the Cold War situation. And what gave me hope in my personal history is seeing, first of all, since I was born in South Africa, seeing apartheid being abolished, Nelson Mandela being released, the death strip and the wall in Germany being teared down, and peaceful revolutions, and all that had a strong impact on me. And I would say that, I mean, we are living in a very difficult time. I know that many young people, they've been traumatized by the pandemic, but they are also traumatized by this daily onslaught of media, of what's really going on. I mean, we cannot deny it in the world in terms of the climate crisis, and all this. So that is traumatizing. But I would say, and that gives me hope, that we don't know the future and the situation can change very quickly. That has been shown in history again and again. Like many people, they really suffer, for instance, under the oppressive Chinese regime or the Chinese Communist Party. Nobody at this stage, they have really built an unprecedented totalitarian surveillance state. Few can imagine that the power of the Communist Party of China, can be broken, but in fact, it is possible quickly. More, so this is just an example, of course, and this gives me hope that we can expect positive, rapid change, and we need to be ready to seize the moment. I think at all levels, but that is also at the level of national governments, where makes me think also how important it is to try to take influence and build relationships and connections, and also maybe that as a final thought on this, also exactly talk to and have an interaction with the potential future leaders, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
In our countries and globally, so they understand what this is about. So I think enlightened progressive global leaders can make a big difference, like Mikhail Gorbachev did.
Mm-hmm.
Without him, I mean, the German peaceful revolution perhaps would not have happened.
Yes. So yes, thank you for sharing your hope. And yes, it's exciting. There's so many possibilities, and the future is not set just because the future is the present's right, like this, of course. And so it's so wonderful that you're doing this work. Okay, we got to get to our other questions. First, actually, with Stefan. Stefan, if you can go right ahead with your comment or question.
Yeah, I'll try and keep this short. I mean, I would agree, Andreas, that it would be easier, fairly easier, or the Chinese government could be brought down fairly quickly. Not so, I don't think, the corporate capitalist sort of economic system of the West, because it is somewhat scattered. And I know, Arthur, whenever you said about, and whenever there was that talk about how, well, corporations could be further ahead with a more stable global situation. I don't know if you've seen the movie, The Corporation. Corporations are basically psychopathic organizations, and for good reason. One of the most positive things that we have as human beings is empathy. And corporations separate people into different categories where they do not see what other people are doing or the effect of their actions, which means that they have no empathy for them. And so this is a huge problem. So I'll try and keep it short, but myself, I'm a socialist, and I do not see the possibility of world government without getting rid of especially corporate capitalism and neoliberal capitalism, because those things are based on profit, not people. And same thing with the environmental disaster that we're in, same thing with the conflicts that we have right now. Whenever corporations have basically a mandate to maximize profit, well, if you're making weapons, the best thing to have is a war so that you can maximize profits. And we can definitely take a look at the conflicts around the world right now and say that a lot of that is driven by the American military industrial complex. And I'm Canadian, I see us as being part of that as well. So That's quite a comment. I think that there is possibilities, but I do not see it under the kind of Chinese regime that is happening right now, as you say, that strict surveillance, or under corporate capitalism that we have in the West. Wonderful movie, Network, which came out in, I think, 1976. It was prescient, an amazing thing. These corporations have more money than the countries, for many, many countries. So anyway, I'll end it at that. And Andreas, if you want to try and comment, I see there are two more questions coming too, and I apologize for taking up too much time.
I can just offer my views on this question. I mean, personally, I support a competitive market economy, however, one that is regulated democratically and in a social way. So, for instance, I would say that there are boundaries and that the state has social responsibility and has to provide social protection, for instance, etc., and labor regulation, etc. But I mean, the key point here is that such regulation would have to be applied globally, right? So, and I wanted to make another remark. In the end, I agree with much you said about corporations, but in the end, it boils down to human beings nonetheless. I mean, who runs these corporations, right? It's human beings too. So I think we need to face that, you know, that we have issues here also with people who run this and who are interested in unbound profit, whatever it takes. And I don't see too much of a difference in principle with what's going on with the, you know, economy in China or elsewhere. It's kleptocratic as well. It's absolutely kleptocratic. So I don't see any socialism taking place in China, really. It's a kleptocratic extraction, you know, based system just as well.
Wow. Oh, well, quickly, we want to go to Quanta. She's next. Quanta, go right ahead.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated your wonderful presentation. And this is my first encounter with democracy without borders. I know a lot of other things without borders, but this is the first time. So I do appreciate it. When you think about democracy without borders, what I like to say spiritual, moral principles that are inclusive in creating that new system, such as we're talking about oneness of humanity and justice in the economic system, and economy being, you know, the corporations having the principle of service to society rather than just competitive. Because I think when our objective is just to make money, because that is the thought that people have, you know, have the highest profit for their shareholders at the expense of stakeholders, right? So what kind of principles are you embedding into that new system that you are envisioning? Thank you very much.
Sure. I mean, I can offer my personal opinion. Democracy Without Borders as an organization, it is, you know, a civil society political advocacy group. It is not a philosophical, spiritual think tank. And it stays away from, at this point at least, from these questions. But of course, I have a personal view and perhaps a personal background in this. I mean, first of all, I think what the point is that, generally speaking, the extremes have to be avoided. I think, you know, imagining a real socialist system is also, you know, a state-driven economy doesn't work. We know that. So that is one extreme that needs to be avoided, in my opinion. And the other extreme that has to be avoided is the state completely staying away from regulating the economy. So I think a balance in between is useful. And I think that as long as the state and companies, you know, they have to pay their share of taxes, which they don't do now, and which allows then the state to provide social, you know, fair social protection, health insurance, etc. that contributes to having a fair and balanced society. And I think also that competition is not per se bad, because competition leads to innovation, and it leads to companies needing to, develop further and to actually, literally outcompete the others on the market, which brings better products, more efficiency, etc. So I think competition is not bad, but it has to be a balanced, a regulated system. That is my personal view. And spiritually, I think this has much to do with this realization of a planetary consciousness. I think that each individual has to develop their own approach. So I wouldn't prescribe this or that is right. In my opinion, one of the key challenges, I believe, is really to accept the different dimensions in human existence. There's rationality that has been stressed through the Enlightenment, rational thought, but that is not all. We also have to integrate empathy, emotions that do exist, and come to some integral understanding of ourselves, and not suppress the shadows that exist in every individual, right? So that would be, like, I don't know whether spiritual is the right word really, but that would be my approach. And we are at a stage, I think, where a new global enlightenment has need to take place. In some instances, it is still about rationality, developing rational thought, but it doesn't stop there. We have to embrace human emotions and this complexity of human psychology.
Very interesting. Well, goodness sakes, we have one last question. Bryden, go right ahead with the comment or question.
Hi, in fact, it's not a question. It's going back to the issue of young people and getting young people involved. And I'm thinking, really, above all, when we're thinking of doing something for the people and something that is not top down, what we need to keep doing is asking the young themselves what they think and how they would go about encouraging these ideas. Ask them for their opinions, get them engaged probably on social media to discuss these things and come out. They're very concerned about the environment right now, and we need to link these ideas with environmental ones. So thank you for all of you. I'm another Canadian who probably shares Stephen's views, but there you go. Not all businessmen are bad people, I know. Anyway, it's to get the young involved. I am most concerned about getting them involved and what is the best way of doing that. So I think bottom up is the way to go.
From my point of view, young people, they are involved. They are involved. Mm-hmm. At least in my organization, they are involved, and they play a major role in pro-democratic efforts around the world. It's often said that the young people are disengaged and not interested. I think that's not true. We can see, you mentioned the climate movement, how that builds actually on young people's activities. So maybe the point is that this has to move in the direction of a global people's movement, that embraces the idea of global democracy. But I would not exclude this happening sometime in the future, not necessarily because we would like to see it happening, but because it just naturally evolves, which I find would be not a surprise.
Wow, interesting. Wow. And goodness sake, so we are closing for now. We're going to go back to Arthur. But before we do, Andreas, I just want to make sure you know how much we appreciate your time, the information, but especially the work you're doing. Incredible and so important. And we're so glad that we're collaborating with you to make this whole thing go smoothly and help the future generations have a nice life here on this beautiful planet. So with that, I'd like to just go back to Arthur. Arthur, take it away.
I wanted to just, first of all, let everybody know how they can get back in touch with you. For example, how can they become involved in the We the People's campaign? How can they directly join in the efforts that you're working on? And how can they get your book, World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century?
First of all, thank you, Melanie, for your very kind words. It was my pleasure to be your guest today and to have this conversation. Well, the book is available in all online bookstores worldwide, I think, not only the usual suspects, but others as well. So you can order it from there. I'm just now working on a second updated and expanded edition that will, I think, be much better than the original one, which is not to say you shouldn't read the original one. But yes, and otherwise, you're very welcome to be in touch with me and Democracy Without Borders, for sure. We are also, by the way, since I heard there are Canadians here, we are also working on a Canadian chapter of Democracy Without Borders just now. And it's easy to get in touch because you can simply find the email address or also an online form on our website. And in terms of the We the People's campaign, which Arthur mentioned at the beginning, is a global platform of NGOs. You can find it at wethepeoples.org, and also there find an online form if you just want to endorse it. And a great contribution always is if you are involved in other organizations, which many people are, you can just ask them to do the same and support that campaign. Thank you for having me again.
And that's We the Peoples with an S, wethepeoples.org. Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. We're very appreciative of having such an enlightened and very informative guest. Next week is going to be our club social, where we can all get together and just chat about some of these issues. You're certainly welcome to join us as well. And then following that, we have on November 15th, we have a very special event. Dr. Rayan Eisler wrote the book The Chalice and the Blade, which became one of the paramount books in shifting our thinking about the dominator culture, both male dominated and the whole domination system, to a more evolved people in equal ways working in partnership to improve the world and to improve their society. Well, we invited Dr. Rayan Eisler, who's been on our podcast before, to comment on the movie Barbie. Now, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it's actually a rather phenomenal movie that takes on the issues of dominance, of whether of how males and females interact and work together. And so she was fascinated. She's had people ask her about that. And so she's going to join us. You can, of course, watch the Barbie movie online before the program on many different platforms. But I think it'll be particularly interesting to hear her comments on it. So we hope that you'll also, we hope everyone, if you're not a member yet, you'll actually become a member of our club. That gives us some support to continue. You can click on to hear about the meetings without becoming a member. But if you become a member and just do contribute $10 a month, that keeps us going, so we can keep this important work going and bring you these important projects. So you get the first 2 months free. So go ahead and click on that at theworldismycountry.com. Click on the podcast tab and join us. Well, thank you, everybody. We look forward to having you join us again next week and every week on the People Powered Planet podcast.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.